Okay, so my name's Connor Covey. My advisor is Andrew Zago, and this is the Object Ground Game. So I have been interested in humor and how it can operate intellectually within architecture. And I look to play on the tropes and tacit rules of architecture, as well as the serious, systematic, and orderly systems brought on by modernism. And on the right is an animation called Harold and the Purple Crayon. And it was a book series done in 1955 by Crockett Johnson and then turned into an animation by HBO in 2002. And what I love about Harold and his crayon is he's absolutely relentless with it, and he'll draw over and on top of the world that he exists in. And in doing this, he is sort of creating his own fiction within that. And he's also very cute and diligent in doing so. Next. And so, first, we'll go over some overarching ideas that this idea launches from. And I think humor can not only be found in architecture itself, but also in the way in which one works and approaches the information he or she is researching. And so in my case, my way of working is kind of through the influence of cartoons and their physics, and also idea of misinterpretation, which we'll see later in my diagramming. And so these two things are sort of injected into what I consider the qualities of the clumsy as they relate to architectural syntax and formal pursuits, and this happens to be the relation to the ground, composition, and tectonic assemblage, which all look to indirectly produce humor. And I think it's important that I'm grounded in these things that are architectural. So here's a condition we always have in architecture. We have the object and we have the ground. And in my case, I've split it into the object and the ground itself into two. One with the object being informal arrangements and informal tectonics. And then the ground I've split into two, which is sort of confusing at first, but I've done so as a formal ground and an informal ground. And I've done this because I need qualities and precision of the formal ground to actually produce the imprecision of the informal ground. And then, so here's some research through images and projects that I've been looking at in relation to the qualities that I've set up. In particular, with informal arrangements, I look at Gary residence because for me it was his transition into this sort of informal arrangement in his work that he sort of took off with from there. And then next to it is the Dominican Mother House by Louis Kahn, where this idea all sort of started last semester with the idea of rotating it into a section condition where the U starts to become a thick wall and eventually a thick line that wrap the objects on the site. In terms of the ground, I've pulled two projects that I consider more formal grounds and two projects that I consider more informal grounds. The formal grounds are Maya Lin's Wave Field, and the other one is Morphosis Diamond Ranch High School. And although these are very good projects, this is sort of what not to do in the thesis. And next to the Morphosis image is a model proposed by Site Architects, where they do a best store in which the parking lot just rolls right over it. And I find this sort of funny. He theorizes it as an idea of an accident. I just think it's a great ground diagram. And then lastly, with tectonics, I look at things I consider to be strange, blunt, and absurd. I think the face house is sort of an example of what I'm looking for, but at the same time, that's not the funny that I'm going for. It's a little too direct. And then with the UTS building on the right, the way that the apertures just sort of pop out of this doubly curved surface. And then sort of the idea of idea extraction. So I'm sort of showing how the precedents that I've been looking at, which I have other images other than the ones that I showed you, are sort of influencing my ideas directly. And I think on the left we sort of know this now through the prior parts of the presentation. But on the right, the idea of the thickened line actually kind of started with Jonathan Lasker and his paintings and looking at the brush stroke and how it's thickened and almost becomes volumetric. And then the influence of cartoon physics. And then again, showing Dominican Mother House in a sense of using the U as a way of kind of creating coherence and difference among the objects. And now we'll look at some ground fictions, or a series I call ground fictions, which are redrawn diagrams that were done with Peter Trummer. They are in relation to particular architects. And what one can notice here is I've sort of misinterpreted them, in which the ground line is thicker. It's drawn as a thickened line, and I'm sort of creating my own fiction of the ground through representation to justify my overall idea of this ground sort of wrapping the object. And so now I'll sort of make a diagrammatic proposition here. If one were to say you have the ground, an object lands on the ground thickens, and then sort of like an elastic-like qualities, it tries to wrestle with the object's And in so it kind of produces its own clumsiness. It's like the line has no motor skills or any coordination in some moments. And then it becomes not ground nor object, but sort of this third thing that blends in and out of the object. And then the next three diagrams on the right are sort of propositions or possibilities that could occur. The first two, the fit and misfit, I could see occurring at the same time and in the same project, where the third one is sort of another option of inversing that situation, where the objects actually go along for the ride. And then lastly, I just want to show that, I have been working on this. One project was last semester with Anything You Like with Andrew Zago, where the thickened line was more about creating coherence of the extremely different objects, but sort of was talked about in a ground sense at the review. And then on the right is an untitled project, which is not only mine, but also Aaron Choi and Kaio Yu with Devin Weiser and Play the Part, where the line actually becomes more three-dimensional and starts to entangle itself and embed itself within the objects. Thank you.
Oh, wow. So we're going to do all of these at once?
Yes, we're going to see four of them, and then
Okay.
you need a pen?
I need some, yeah, I'm not going to be able to remember this. Thank you.
Yeah, no, we will.
Yeah, got it. Thank you.
Sorry, that's not mine. Try. Hi, my name is James Kubiniec. My advisor is Alcolena Manfredini. And my thesis is about the scales of representation and about zooming into some of these images that I've created that deal with a recognizable character at a very small scale, low resolution, 8-bit image that's reversing the abstraction into something that is increasingly complex. So I took characters that were very recognizable, like Mega Man, and in this case assigned 3 different line type qualities to it. And by doing so, I thought that you can increase the complexity and turn up the resolution and abstract in a reversing way where it, rather than reducing something to its most simple qualities, where you can still read that character, it actually starts to blur away by adding a lot of complexity to the image, and then zooming into these moments and finding interesting qualities about it. So turning points to vectors that are infinitely scalable became something that was really interesting. So at least to me, so the qualities of a pixel and its issues of resolution at a very small scale became an interest where when you turn it into a vector, it becomes infinitely scalable, and you could print it at the size of a building, or print it at an even larger scale depending on how you output that resolution. So something about that information change became a really big interest for me. So like pointillism, the increasing complexity of blurring the relationship with high density amounts of lines and different scales of sort of scaling up strokes started to yield a blurry sort of reading of color, line, and it became something that was interesting in the subjectivity of perception, sort of not the objectivity of reality. And so in this case, again, relating back to pointillism, dividing color into components, creating an optical sort of mixture became interesting, and seeing how things read at different scales, and then when you blow them up, reading through that as layers of transparency, playing with things like opacities, playing with things like different line weights and different variations of shapes, so rectangles, lines, and overlaying things to create a new type of image, but still it's strangely familiar to the original image of Mr. T in this case. And then for this example, the mushroom man, he is completely obliterated with a new form that starts to completely obscure what it actually was. And then playing with and controlling and harnessing this way of creating this abstraction and playing with the way that things line up and playing with the way that things also misalign has started to become a big interest, but also keeping things slightly related to the original parent in this case, with dots relating back to the dots of the mushroom man, or certain colors being pulled out of their original parent. And then playing with very simple arrangements of just vectors with arrows attached to it and letting them dance around, and then paint the image again in a new way, but it blurs the edge of the line. And so that became an interest in keeping things simple and taking away color, stripping it away from color and keeping it very transparent, but adding that complexity. So if abstraction is a process of erasing legible features, one would think that complexity is a process of adding specificity. So again, in this project, it's the opposite that happens, creating an oxymoron of sorts, where the more complex and the more possibility of creating abstract moments on the canvas happens. So also playing with things of fill and playing with stroke that it isn't about the line stroke quality itself, it's about the fill and adding gradients to the fill or adding patterns to the fill and letting that overlay and cut away at the image became an interest as well. And then seeing these things in multiple frames and multiple orientations against each other starts to yield qualities a little bit of just a new set of characters, which became quite interesting as well. And they're starting to multiply and make their own sort of field conditions in and of themselves next to each other or in different arrangements. So this thesis identifies a new process of abstraction by adding specificity. So a new form of representation is born. And essentially it's seeing the computer as a tool to implement these tests of technology. So in this case, testing stroke, but adding dashes to stroke gave a completely different result. And then harnessing that with rotations and then adding these, zooming into these areas, not only yields depth, but it also yields new types of patterns. And patterns that can be generated and layered on top of one another to then add sort of new flattened or depth or readings of depth that I found very interesting, both from a faraway scale and from an up-close scale. And then testing things that aren't just assignments of line, but assignments of point. And this sort of relates back to pointillism again. When it blurs the image based on the up-close reading, but then from afar you can still paint the image, but it paints a different color, like Georges Seurat's painting that yields a purple color, but it's actually made up of tiny little blue and red lines that are very close to each other. But you see a shade of purple that's much more even. So in this case, I put a bunch of fingers that are attached to a vector that are behind this layer that then blur out the background, and then they're attached in with another layer of arrows. So I'm playing with arrows, points, dots, color, fill, lines, outlines, things like that. Thank you.
Sasha, remember to get closer to the mic.
Okay.
Because we're recording it, so.
Okay. In the optical unconscious, Rosalind Krauss describes John Ruskin's stare and its detachment from the field of purpose. He would merely watch the sea and simply stare and wander with a childlike, consuming visual fire. He tended to find patterns and observe minute details in subjects ranging from the ocean to a patch of carpet. Krauss uses Ruskin's view hunting to distinguish between two fields of the visual, the infinitely multiple, or details, and the simultaneously unified, patterns. Charles Baudelaire described a similar character, Monsieur G, as possessing the fixed and animally ecstatic gaze of a child, and who began by being an observer of life. 17th century Dutch artists were considered world describers, who, unlike Italian artists at the time, took a formal rather than narrative approach to art. As Panofsky claimed about Dutch artist Jan van Eyck, his eye operates as a microscope and a telescope at the same time. Neither is a good instrument with which to observe human emotion. In I Am for Tendencies, Jeffrey Kipnis and Peter Eisenman debate about the pedagogical and cultural importance of close reading in architecture. Kipnis argues that the repertoire of close reading needs to shift to include more context and complexity in order to prevent the degradation of architecture into a design discipline. The technique has its origins in literary pedagogy. Part of the new criticism movement in the middle decades of the 20th century, close reading places the reader as a discoverer of meaning and the text as a self-contained aesthetic object that holds the meaning to be discovered. It excludes the reader's response, author's intention, historical and cultural context, and the moralistic bias from analysis. I ask myself if detailed description, or what Svetlana Alpers refers to as the art of describing, has any place in this conversation. Could Ruskin's stare or Monsois-G's gaze inform us of something critical that is missing from the discourse in architecture, from the practice of close reading? The descriptive turn is a phrase borrowed from Heather Love's essay, Close but Not Deep, Literary Ethics and the Descriptive Turn. She explains that this alternative mode of reading relies on description rather than interpretation. With this, the familiar describable world becomes problematic, an object of questioning, no longer a starting point, but an end point of analysis. Love claims that observation-based social sciences serve as a model for this technique. So in this slide, this is kind of superfluous, but I found it interesting that with this idea of detailed description, that requires systems of description. And one important aspect of describing is how do you prove veracity, or how do you prove that something is fact? And the original definition of fact, which is now obsolete, meant a thing done or performed, to do or to make, which I found very interesting. So in my thesis, I will use the method of detailed description as a beginning and end point to an architectural project. I would choose a difficult site to survey, measure, and picture using inscription and image-making techniques. One prospective site is a border, more specifically, a border that exists between two countries, one that ignores topographical boundaries and marks a hard line over the land. Historically, these lines were determined in written form, in a treaty, and later manifested by a surveyor in the form of a physical demarcation or simply drawn onto a map. I am interested in what this line looks like. Can it be seen or measured? What is the veracity of its representation on a map, in digital or paper form, relative to its physical presence on the land? So in exploring different systems of description, one technique that I was looking at was experimenting with, it's pretty dark, how to achieve parallax. I'm not sure how this will connect exactly, but I'm just looking at different ways of visualizing, keeping in mind the other research. Basically. Yeah.
Thank you.
That's it. Thank you.
Sasha, will you change slides? Yes. Nithya, I'll move the mic. You'll know when I change the slide here.
The prosaic image. With a vision to transform the urban fabric not as a singular static unit, but as an intricately woven fabric of spatial experiences, this thesis challenges the most dominant mode of architectural representation, the perspective, and its implications on being perceived as sublime. Sublime is a quality of greatness beyond all possibilities seen in architecture. The unsublime, on the other hand, is an aesthetic quality lacking any relevance. The prosaic is something that appears completely ordinary when seen with the naked eye. Sublime, within the scope of architecture, is a part of a greater ordinance when studying space. Within that, there are two sources for this quality: perspective, vanishing points, or layers and layering seen in density. The examples are categorized based on the role. Of perspective. Their interior and exterior quality, their reality and fake reality are properties that are studied closely. Each of them have overlapping relationships, which further help me understand how perspective really works. So within these examples, I studied, for example, the reality and flat perspective. I studied the Founding Hospital by Brunelleschi. For interior, exterior, and single vanishing points, I studied Teatro Olimpico. For the fake reality, I studied Veronese. Using those examples and these quantities, I studied the comparison between single and multiple vanishing points to see the extent of perspective and sublime that's achieved in each of them. There's a need that arises to see how the sublime and prosaic can be compared and understood in terms of the existing aesthetic terminologies. That's where I studied the banal, the utilitarian, serene, vastness, beauty, and grotesque, all terminologies that relate to these three terms. It becomes clear that the ordinary and the banal have very little in common with grotesque and beauty in architecture. The relationship between the prosaic and sublime is a reciprocal. My thesis seeks to explore a merger between and within this reciprocity. This is a preliminary study of how you can combine ordinary things and so this is a chart that basically shows how different sublime and prosaic are within aesthetic theory, and the centers where I'm imagining my thesis to create a merger between the two. This is a preliminary study of how you can combine ordinary things with the sublime to create a new perspective, and the ordinary everyday portions of a city that lacks this quality, like abandoned sites, narrow alleys, and anything that comes along one's journey. There is a hidden necessity for these spaces to also be imagined as, even though they're still imagined as prosaic, there's a necessity to see the sublime quality within it. Thank you.
Okay. Well, that is a lot to take in. So what's the format from here? I mean, I can do a quick response and maybe get the discussion going?
Yes.
Okay.
Can you guys hear that?
We load it all on you.
Okay, well, no, look, I mean, the first thing I would say is those are four really sophisticated and I think suggestive and interesting thesis formulations. And I like the fact that the arguments are made as much with the images as you know, as with a kind of verbal argument. So I wasn't quite sure I understood your animation at the end. I don't know if you want to, can you just say a little bit about what that was?
I think, so in one of the texts I was reading, Bruno Latour is writing about different methods of inscription paired with visual techniques and to basically describe something. And I'm not sure if parallax plays a role, but it was just something I wanted to experiment with. So that's kind of more on the side.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's certainly, I mean, parallax would be an interesting way into that. Well, I mean, look, a couple of, maybe just general remarks about Thesis, and stop me if any of this is overly familiar or it's things you've heard before. I mean, I'm at one level, I'm really sympathetic with the project of thesis prep, but I think it's a fraught project because you're theorizing about a project that doesn't yet exist. And there's a kind of a trap, which is that the thesis itself then becomes the illustration of the thesis prep hypothesis. And frankly, I don't think any of you are really falling into that, but it's something that I think just needs to be put on the table, that you as you go forward from here, you need to blur the boundary between research, formulation, and the production of a project. For the second one, for James, I really like the fact that you're already doing visual experiments, and I would encourage everybody. You're already starting to diagram. I think it's, if anything, I think a lot of theorization in architecture actually happens post facto. Theorization is not so much formulating a project in advance and then executing it. A lot of theorization is post facto trying to figure out what you did and how to situate it in the kind of larger structure of the discipline. So I would just push everyone to start the visual and architectural explorations earlier as part of the thesis prep process. And again, I'm seeing some of that already here. I actually teach a thesis prep course for the post-professional students at Princeton, so a lot of this is very much in my own mind and thinking and questions that I've worried over in the past couple of years, well, many years actually. Although interestingly enough, as Marcelyn knows very well, there was no thesis at Columbia, whereas on the other hand, thesis is so deeply embedded in Princeton's culture. So certainly as long as I've been at Princeton, thinking about the problematics of thesis has been really kind of fundamental. I have two favorite formulations, one of which I'm pretty sure is familiar to you. The other may not. Have you talked about Gregory Ulmer at all and his CATTI formulation?
Yeah, that cat, we chased that cat.
You chased that cat? Okay, well.
He may be allowed to come back.
He may be allowed to come back. Well, it's a useful formulation. If you Google Gregory Ulmer, CATTT, last T is lowercase, you'll find the text. And of course, see if I remember what the initials stand for. But so the first C stands for contrast, and I think it's a way of recognizing that whenever you set out to do work in a particular field, you're operating in some sort of conversation with the history of the field, the deep history, but also the contemporary history. So you're always responding to something. So the idea that the argument of contrast, that you're answering somebody else's proposition with a new proposition of your own. The second T is theory. That is to say, and what he means there, I think, is not so much that you are, again, producing a kind of abstract theoretical statement, but that you're starting from, and I think this is something, again, very fundamental to thesis, and again, part of the problematic of thesis. Thesis projects always benefit from specificity, and I think, again, all of you have done a very good job there, that you've picked up on a very specific technique or problematic, and you're exploring it. But a thesis is only successful at the point that it achieves some level of generality. So the theory move in Ulmer's formulation is to bring the specific discussion to some level of generalization. So the third, the second T is target. And interestingly enough, for somebody associated with deconstructivism in philosophy, Ulmer was very interested in almost a kind of pragmatics, that whatever the proposition is actually has a sort of target in the world, so that you could take it in a way out of the specific world of the specific discipline of architecture and have some generalized application in the world. Another one of my favorite formulations of a thesis, again very simple, is you take a problem from the discipline, you take a problem from the world, and you find some sort of new fit between them. I think maybe, in a kind of, let's say, sort of negative way, you can say that thesis projects fail either because they're too bound up with a problem in the world. Somebody wants to solve global warming with their Master of Architecture thesis, which, trust me, you're not going to do, or they're too bound up with internal disciplinary questions, and they don't address anything in the world. It seems to me at this point, and trust me, in the large scheme of things, I think it's more important to start from disciplinary issues, and I think you can easily get lost if you're trying too hard to project it outside. But I would love to see all of these projects in the next phase sort of make some sort of pass at what this would mean, out there in the world, outside of the disciplinary realm of architecture. So, and then finally, the little lowercase t in the Ulmer formulation stands for tale, and that can be T-A-L-E, as in telling a story. Again, I think this is very important, that part of what you do as an architect is tell stories. You create a narrative, and you find the way of again, all of you are sort of telling a story in a way. But it can also be tale, T-A-I-L, in the sense that the project leaves a trace in the world. It leaves a tale in the world, T-A-I-L, in the world. So, again, that signals that ambition to have some sort of leave some sort of mark on the world with the work. So, having been told that I'm bringing out-of-date theories back, I think it is a useful formulation. What?
The A.
Oh, I forgot. Sorry. Thank you. Yes. Yes, I forgot the A. Analogy. Yes. Analogy. I think if you could say the C is a kind of vertical argument, you're entering into the sort of hierarchy of precedent. Analogy is a horizontal move. What is it? What other thing is it like? Right? Yeah. Thank you. That's an important thing. How are you opening up the problematic by the process of analogy? Very important. Thank you.
So I would just to give you the backstory of
Yes.
the CATTt, which
Yeah.
the students probably don't know about, but the faculty certainly remember. I mean, I'd say 5-6 years ago, we actually structured thesis prep around Ulmer's formula. And so everyone had a pet cat.
Right.
And what happened is that there were so many cats that it became a kind of very transparent crutch, and all of the projects began to be formulated according to that method.
Yeah.
Now, it is true, and if I could just very quickly to sort of specify how the CATTt has worked successfully. I mean, if you think of two writers, so Jenks and Eisenman, both writing at the same time in the 70s.
Right.
And they both take on a contrast, which you could say would be modernism.
Right.
Right? That they want to reframe the way modernism talked about. Their analogies are also the same. They both say, let's talk about modernism not in terms of function, not in terms of technology, but in terms of language.
Right.
Right? And so then they bring in different theories. Jenks goes to a theory of semiotics.
Right.
Eisenman goes to a more syntactical version, so depending on which text you take.
Yeah.
And then they both have slightly different targets, right? Venturi is in a fight, or sorry, Jenks is in a fight with Venturi.
Right.
You know, he wants to claim postmodernism from Venturi. Eisenman's in a fight with Rowe.
Right.
And so they have different theories and different targets that are
Right.
aimed. And then if you think about the tales, Jenks very strangely at that time adopts a kind of cartoon technique in the language of postmodernism.
Exactly, yeah.
Where Eisenman radicalizes Rowe's diagrams. So
Right.
one way to look at the tale is as the operative technique that makes the object
Right.
go. You could also say that Jenks is really concentrating on building massing as the primary locus of attention, where the kind of sculptural, he wanted ducks as opposed to sheds.
Sure.
Whereas Eisenman was directing much of his attention at plans.
Sure.
And so as that kind of, you can see how
Yeah.
you can start to slot
Yeah.
arguments very usefully into that framework. And so if anybody is interested in that, it's chapter 1 of Heuretics, The Logic of Invention by Gregory Ulmer. And I'm happy to go back through it with any of you, but it was something that we specifically kind
Yes,
of
exactly.
got tired of.
Yeah, I can see that. But I'm always in favor of bringing back these obsolete things. But you can blame me if you have a population of feral cats. Well, the version I like is actually the Kipnis gloss, which was the one I was assuming that you know, which is basically 3 steps, right? Which is, first of all, you have to convince us that the problem that you're working on belongs to the discipline. Again, I think all of you did that quite well. Second, which remains very useful to me, is identify the vulnerable cliché. Right? It's a version of Ulmer's contrast. Right? And then the third, which is essentially Jeff kind of compressing the rest of Ulmer's argument, is to produce a viable counter-proposal. So again, I think what I'm seeing so far, I think everybody here has sort of done the first 2 steps of that. Although, again, I think if I have one very, very minor complaint for Connor, but it's really just for future presentations, never start your presentation by saying, I am interested in X. So.
Thank you.
I mean, let me backtrack on that a little bit, which is that I feel very, very strongly that the only reason on the planet to do a thesis is because you're passionately interested in a problem, right? So that should definitely be there, right? I mean, again, look, a thesis that's done out of some sort of obligation that this is a big important issue I have to work on, and it's never going to be interesting. Something that you are, and again, I look at these diagrams and I know you're super interested in this stuff. So, but it's a bit like that advice that's given to writers, which is show, don't tell. So show us you're passionate and interested. Don't tell us you're interested. So minor complaint, but for next time.
But I do think what was really striking to me was your use of the diagrammatic proposition. I mean, you really claimed that through working through diagram to make this series of comparisons between these different arguments, that your own diagram then originates your thesis. And so I thought that was really well formulated, the diagrammatic proposition, as opposed to just the general statement.
No, absolutely. I guess what I would love to see in your project, and I think this idea of the thickened line is really, really interesting. I mean, I think that's a kind of genuine sort of discovery. And again, if you think about the history of the discipline, I mean, the absolute centrality of the line and linearity. I assume you've read the Catherine Ingram book called Burdens of Linearity, or you've looked at this. You know, Catherine makes this extended argument that, you know, not only are drawing techniques fundamentally based on the problem of the line and the role of the line as something that marks out and divides and partitions, but the linearity of thinking that is so deeply embedded in modernism, right? I mean, you know, Le Corbusier is talking, you know, the poem of the right angle, and he has this critique of the donkey's path, right? The donkey's path. You're saying the donkey's path is actually much more interesting, right? That, you know, you know, it's like the line that Harold draws. So I think that's really, I think that's super interesting and productive. How you get from your starting point with humor to the diagrams and the line is not totally clear to me. So I think you could make that connect. I was going to say you could draw that line a little more clearly, but I mean, I think certainly. I mean, diagrams and cartoons share something to begin with. Diagrams can be kind of funny. I don't know. I mean, I think those are so because I mean, when you first started presenting, I thought the project was going in a very different direction, and I don't know if you know, again, you know, to sort of say what you're not doing is maybe not necessarily what you want to do in a thesis prep, but certainly it seems to me that you need to distinguish what you're doing from postmodern irony. I mean, Jenks again comes back here, but you know, figures like Venturi and Tigerman especially. I don't know if Tigerman I assume has come up in your discussions, but you know. Super interesting stuff. What else did I say here? Yeah, that was essentially. You know, I think super interesting thesis. I guess. The translation. Well, maybe that's a question for the faculty in the room. What are the ambitions for the thesis work itself? Is it meant to translate into a project? Can it stay more at the level of research and representation?
I think
What's the
that
current state of the debate here at the school?
No, I think that there's a range. I think that's why you see very different projects today.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, and I think that the aim is one of discovery, and then at the same time, I think that also of kind of new path of research. So I would say that some projects might end up some theses might end up in projects, some theses might stay within an idea of representation. So there's a whole range in scale, in topic, and so on, which is, I would say, is embraced. And I think that, and I think that I think that the seed of that happens through thesis. Thesis prep, I think, to your point earlier, like, maybe stays way too much within the kind of search and the research. And sometimes it takes on too late this idea of the kind of study or the investigation. And that I agree with you, almost as sometimes you want to start in reverse. It wouldn't work for all students. 86 students might not work in the same way, which is also another issue of the kind of the range and the diversity of the means of research and the type of projects at the end and so on. And also the methodologies by the instructors, each instructor group.
But I do think that something, that Sam brought up just now about taking a problem from the world and starting to kind of involve your maybe more disciplinary research and kind of grapple with that problem and find a way that the two can resonate with one another, I think that's hugely important, because otherwise you're limiting your audience to only a disciplinary audience. I mean, I think it's something, I would say in Sasha's case, for instance, that the thesis, there is a very, very extremely disciplinary discussion there, the Bruno-Latour visualization and cognition, the whole act of how we make something exist or how we create a real thing.
Right.
How do we make something real? How do we make this border real? And that is extremely, like, even the moment you start to talk about the border, a geographic border between territories, it's incredibly relevant and current, and it speaks to a larger audience. And so I think that's really a wonderful place for a thesis to be, where those things start to create
exactly.
tension.
And I mean, we'll come back to that second one, but we're going to do this, formulaically in order. So yeah, I mean, I think your approach is a really interesting case of that, that question. I mean, you have a problem in the world. Let me say this, that at one moment I kind of internally cringed a little bit when you talked about the Mexico-U.S. border. I mean, I've got a thesis student at Princeton this semester whose, starting point was mid-sized cities that shifted from blue to red in the last election. And the question I ask her is, 10 years from now, do you really want to present a thesis that's so tied to the 2016 election? So on the other hand, so maybe it's just a different border, I mean, it's just...
Border. I was just kind of looking at some examples.
But I think, I mean, again, I think we can all, or maybe I'm speaking for myself, I can get over my internal cringe over that question, because I think, again, I would just simply say at this moment that you've done exactly what I was saying. You have a kind of, to borrow one of your terms, you have a close reading of a disciplinary problem, and you have a problem in the world, a real problem, and I hadn't put those two things together in my mind before, and I think it's really an interesting, super interesting. You haven't by any chance read Thomas Pynchon's novel Mason and Dixon? It's a big fat book. Put it by the side of your bed and read 20 pages. It'll take you a year. But it's as the title suggests. It's well, first of all, it's sort of deeply embedded in sort of 18th century thought. I mean, not so distant from some of the Svetlana Alpers things, because the first thing that Mason and Dixon did together was go to some island in the middle of the South Seas to chart the transit of Venus, which was necessary in order to accurately plot longitude. And so, very much bound up in this sort of 18th century scientific world, and the emergence of the telescope, obviously, which is something that Svetlana Alpers talks about, and then coming to the United States and surveying this line. And what was interesting, I mean, it was a line in the middle so it was a border. It's a border between I think Virginia and Pennsylvania. And it was actually, even in the sort of 18th century context, highly fraught. But one of the things I loved about that is that they had to cut what was called a visto. So in order to get a visual sighting for the surveying, they had to cut a swath through the forest. So they were both surveying the boundary, which they had to do by charting it in relationship to the stars, and they were physically cutting a line, across the landscape. And since it's Thomas Pynchon, there are weird subplots about mechanical ducks and so it's I think, I don't know, it might be suggestive for you, I think, because it's just re-articulating some of that territory. But so yeah, I mean, again, I would say, in the next, we're talking about 3 weeks, 2.5 weeks, right? I think you've done your work in the kind of sort of theoretical sphere. I think more sort of research, and I don't know, maybe you have to go out literally in the field and try and understand some of these borders. And again, I think there's a difference between a border and a boundary as well. Boundary. Gerald Fruge, who's in the Kennedy School at Harvard, talks about sort of legal spatialization and sort of legal terms. Somebody might be helpful there. I think, I don't know, different context. A.L. Weissman, you've probably looked at a little bit, and, all of his, A.L. has written, I think, very, about how obviously, again, a very fraught political boundary, but how that's he has this wonderful account in some of these debates over the boundary between the Palestinians and the Israelis, of they commissioned architectural models because the topography of the boundary was so complicated. And these incredible, those sort of courtroom renderings of the judges looking at these architectural models, trying to figure out this boundary. So, you're onto something. So, yeah. 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 Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, so it seems one of the things that you're getting at, and I think it's a perennial problem with thesis prep, is that thesis projects are made out of forms. They're not made out of footnotes.
Right.
And so I think what happens is that you tend to kind of go in and look for the intellectual territory that you're going to occupy,
right.
And it's very easy to slip down the footnote rabbit hole.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, and this has to do with some of the prohibitions that I've developed over the years for thesis, like you're not allowed to use ities or isms or ologies or any, because they keep you at a distance from form. And that's another thing that theory does. That theory, if you look at the etymology of the word, it comes from theory, theorein and thauma, and it has to do with observation from a distance and the spectacle of the theater, right? But what's very important about it is that theory comes after. The theory is what you make sense of what happened. And what theories tend to make sense of is the difference between seeming and being, right? Between phenomenology and ontology. And there's basically two kinds of theories, boring ones and interesting ones. Boring theories close the gap between phenomenology and ontology. They say, so for instance, a boring theory would be, wood seems like a natural material, and hey, look at that, it is. An interesting theory actually operates more like a joke, exactly, in that it opens the gap between phenomenology and ontology. So an interesting theory about wood seems to be natural, but in fact, if you look at it for just a second, you realize it's totally artificial. It's the construction of artifice. And if you want to talk about natural wood, you have to talk about trees, But if you're talking about wood in architecture, it's always about artifice. And so then you can begin to look at wood in a different way because the theory has denied your assumptions about a set of problems that you're already familiar with, right? So it's, in a way, it's another way of setting up the contrast and analogy. And so I think that to kind of, and all of this is written up in a really great essay by Murray Davis called That's Interesting, from about 1973. But the point is that I think that we have a tendency to use theory in a more kind of clinical way where we're trying to finally arrive at an answer. Yeah. And I think that what's more productive in the thesis prep context is to use theory to kind of open up questions. You know, so the theory is not about producing knowledge, it's not about producing answers, it's about making available the space of surprise or wonder or awe. And so you can look at something that you thought you knew in a new way, you can find something that you didn't know existed and bring it to the table. And I would say there are three concepts that you can kind of track that kind of help keep you in the right direction. One is clarity. Clarity leads you to boring theories, right? Clarity produces answers and knowledge. But what you can look for instead is incongruity. Right? Incongruity is when you arrive at something that doesn't fit any categories that you already have. Right? My favorite turns out to be ambiguity, where you find something that very precisely fits multiple categories. You know, and so I find that because we're sort of trained to produce knowledge in a very particular kind of way, we tend to pursue clarity. But the trick, I think, in prep is to pursue incongruity and ambiguity. And there are versions of that. I think, James, you know, again, your projects are producing this kind of, like, you have the object that you can now theorize. You don't have much of a theory, and I think, you know, what you're doing is kind of grabbing at big concepts that are probably too big for this thing to hold. So I think to kind of dial back the theoretical ambitions would maybe make sense. But what's nice is that you have the thing, and the thing is quite compelling. And just to begin to try to figure out exactly how it works, as opposed to figure out what pre-existing category it belongs in. And you know, Sasha, I mean, we've talked about this kind of descriptive stuff too. I think border, again, is one kind, you know, geographical political borders are one kind of border, but, you know, the space between these two tables is a kind of border as well. And so to think about how, you know, how could we look at that definition that you're wrestling with a little bit sideways in order to open up new territory rather than revisit the...
Sure, even, I mean, again, I mean, how, you know, I mean, You could say there's been I think it's safe to say that there's been a fairly large-scale shift in the discipline, but from, you know, gosh, we could probably already talk about 20 years ago, the fascination with smoothness and connectivity, which coincided with the emergence of digital technologies that could create smooth warped surfaces. But it also coincided with the emergence of internet culture and the idea that everything is connected. And, you know, I think we've become correctly skeptical of that embrace of smoothness and connectivity. And that you know, as architects, we're much more in the business of partitioning space than we are of operating within a kind of smooth interconnected space. That obviously today, you know, the reality of space is smoother and more interconnected, but the borders and the boundaries and even, you know, things like building envelopes haven't gone away. So I did just, sorry, I was just looking back at my notes, and a little bit more towards your earlier descriptions. What I'm missing is other maybe somewhat more recent uses of objective description. I mean, well, it's not that recent, but the novels of Robbe-Grillet, and I'm getting recognition. Yeah, the photography of the Beckers, You know, so that you don't necessarily have to go back to Svetlana Alpers for objective description. It's very much, you know, part of at least, you know, 20th century, if not 21st century visual culture. But just picking up on what Todd was saying, I think for me what the first and the last projects do, which again I think is perfectly legitimate thesis exercise, is they're trying to kind of tease out and describe and theorize a sensibility, right? And I think that, to me, that's, you know, again, it's not something you, I mean, again, I've always been sort of puzzled by this gap in schools of architecture that, you know, I think the conversations the students have in the studio are very different than the conversations that are held in a kind of structured review kind of, you know, I'll bet a lot of the conversations that the students have in the studio are like, well, you know, I really like that. You know, I mean, even, look, I mean, read Venturi's Complexity and Contradiction, you know, he says, I like things that are boring and ordinary, you know, and again, I think in different ways, all of these thesis projects are kind of motivated by that, you know, that, you know, these are things I like. I guess minor quibble, you know, I would look more at Jasper Johns than Rauschenberg for the prosaic, but it was this remark that Gerhard Richter said about Rauschenberg, that he's too interesting. So, you know, so you know, or for that matter, Jonathan Lasco, right? But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I'm very sympathetic to the sensibility you're describing, but you know, maybe it's my own inability to describe it any better than you have done that leaves me with this sensation that it's still not quite there. And you know, again, maybe it needs to be exemplified with, I don't know, not so much choosing examples, but maybe doing some experiments or showing how in your own projects this is important. I mean, again, because they're just, and also I mean, you know, look, generally I'm very much in favor of using art world references. I think it could benefit from, because of course there is a history of this within the discipline. I'm missing a little bit the disciplinary history of the everyday. Smithson's, the as found, you know, there's an essay by Allison Smithson, I believe, called the As Found. And you know, look at Britain in the 50s and 60s, what was called kitchen sink realism. So I think, I don't know, I guess, I mean, I'm all in favor of looking at examples from painting, but I think maybe film, architecture, I don't know, I know I'm kind of contradicting myself there and saying, you know, do it through your own projects, but here, go look at these other examples. But I am missing a little bit I don't think you can tell the story entirely through examples from painting. And I know you had architectural examples, but your architectural examples tended to be historical, not contemporary.
Right.
And the other thing is, I don't buy the argument about perspective, honestly, in this context. First of all, I don't think perspective is a dominant representational tool in architecture. Actually, I mean, it comes quite late to architecture. I think we're a little bit, you know, we tend to think that way today because perspective is very easy to make, but I don't know. So, you know, my criticism isn't clear maybe, but perhaps represents a little bit, that reflects a little bit of lack of clarity of the presentation.
Well, I think part of the trick might be, and again, as we sort of close out prep, like some of these things are maybe advice for next year's prep class, or maybe you can do this really fast. But what I think is potentially promising is the idea of combining masterpieces in perverse ways. I agree that kind of getting out of the honoring Fleming history of art textbook and getting into slightly different and like fresher images, even if they are, to go back to somebody like Palozzi or Nigel Henderson, I think that's a good example. But to try to figure out how far can painting go and where does architecture have to take over? Yeah, I think that's an interesting way to set up a prep investigation. Right. Like, so painting is able to achieve. It's the analogy, right? Painting is able to achieve certain things, but it cannot go here. Right. And so if we want to take it there, we need to make recourse to architecture. So what is the, one of the things that you find when you look at the new brutalism is that the art that is generally associated with brutalism and the architecture that is associated with brutalism have next to nothing to do with it. Exactly, really nothing. Yeah. And there's an issue of October that looked at the new brutalism 5 years ago or so. And that was one of the really striking things, where a series of attempts by very strong scholars to make a kind of umbrella that accommodated Palozzi and the Hunstanton school in the same category. It just doesn't work. It's true. It doesn't work at all. And so what that means is there's an opportunity that brutalism is an insufficiently nuanced category to accommodate this set of ambitions. That if we start to rearrange it, we can understand. We may be able to open up a gap within which new opportunities are available.
Yeah. And I think it would require paying a little bit closer attention to the techniques of the paintings themselves, right? I mean, so the difference between the Caspar Friedrich and the Rauschenberg is not only a question of image. It's also, it has to do with Rauschenberg's use of collage, with his incorporation of silkscreen painting into. You've probably read, I hope you've read, the Leo Steinberg essay called The Flatbed Printing Press, right? So, that idea that suddenly the canvas becomes this repository for stuff as opposed to a window on the world, right? I mean, as much as the difference in the imagery, that's the difference between the Rauschenberg and the for Leo Steinberg, again, it's Johns, not Rauschenberg, but the argument could be made with Rauschenberg. I mean, if anything, for me, Rauschenberg is still a bit of a window to the world, whereas Johns and then later, somebody like Jonathan Lasker is so insistently a kind of catch-all surface for detritus in a way.
But one thing that I want to just point out in the way that Stan is describing these painters and paintings is that you're not making recourse to a big abstract categorical definition to make the case. You're actually trying to tease out a different kind of meeting.
Sure.
Repository of stuff versus window on the world. Right. I mean, we could find versions of that in the discourse of art, but you're actually constructing a new theory on the fly. Sure. And that's the kind of thing that I think prep is designed for. Right. And so as an example of that kind of, a book that I have read recently that I think is a really great example of this kind of talking is David Sally's How to See, which just came. It's a collection of Sally's essays where he says, right at the outset, he's like, I'm writing as a painter about painters, and I am trying very hard in these essays to talk about painting as painters talk to each other. Exactly. Yeah. As opposed to talk about these paintings as critics talk to us. Right. And I do think that having that kind of very serious shop talk as a model is a really good way to go. And what that sounds like is that there are far fewer big categorical abstract nouns that are supposed to be verbs. And way more kind of messy, kind of funky, kind of half-thought attempt to make a case for something that doesn't quite have a
Exactly.
slot in the
Right.
rack yet.
Right.
Well, that's where I think that the use of the word prosaic can be, I mean, you have to be extremely precise about how you are defining that
Right.
through the examples, because like the use of oracle, that piece of Grafenberg's, which is actually a kind of interactive piece which has sound. It's not just about these things being pieces of detritus that are put out as art, but there's a whole other discussion in that piece that I think would make it not prosaic at all. And so I think you have to really attain a much finer degree of clarity, as James as well. I think you were kind of pitching abstraction against complexity. I think what your project is dealing with actually is the idea that you're bringing in a very dense amount of what you're calling information into a representational space. And then paradoxically, as you point out, that's where the kind of tension exists, that we're not actually getting clarity, but it's starting to open itself up to multiple readings, as opposed to making itself more precise. And so that paradox, I think, is really fascinating, but I do think it's also not incidental what those images are. Like, I think you, at a certain point, have to really think about that. You know, is it the Pac-Man, or is it, I mean, what are those kind of images? If this is becoming a facade, how does that resonate in, you know, that, I think that is something that right now wasn't on the table.
So you're saying
remarkably beautiful.
Own up to your 80s video game fetish?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely, yeah.
Or that, you know, it
Yeah.
reminds me of in the 60s, the early Bell Labs engineers who did, I think I mentioned this to you, James, did the computer art with
Right.
where they could only use the characters that would come out in the printout sheet. But they made these really pedestrian and banal things,
Yeah.
like they make, you know.
Well, I think it
maze.
was, I may be wrong, I think it was Paula Scheer who did the first icons for the Mac when the resolutions were incredibly low. And, you know, she talks about how to achieve that legibility with the incredibly low pixel resolution at the time. So if you can find that. But yeah, sorry, just to, first of all, I want to, you know, just again sort of cycle back. I mean, you know, certain of my colleagues who are not practitioners are critical of this idea of shop talk. And, you know, again, I'm with Todd, you know. I mean, it's this idea, there's absolutely nothing wrong with shop talk. I mean, you know, this sort of intricate discussions about, you know, how do you do that, and
Right.
you know, and then, you know, and then you jump off from there about, you know, thinking about what it means. One more reference for you, a favorite essay of mine, which I assigned to my thesis students, and they all were somewhat perplexed by it, but it's a great essay. It's also just written beautifully. It's by Frederick Bartlemy, Barthelme. You know this essay? It's called On Being Wrong. And it's, well, he doesn't use it, but there's this Andy Warhol quote. He says, "I like what happens when you get something exactly wrong." So, so Frederick Bartlemy is a novelist, still alive. His novels are very much about the prosaic. They're about, you know, people living in townhouse blocks on the outside of Houston, or you know, his father was an architect, actually, taught at the University of Houston. His older brother was the much more famous novelist, Donald Bartlemy. And part of the essay is exactly that. It's a brilliant essay because it's about how, you know, writers talk about finding their voice. And he's talking about finding his voice as a writer and situating himself in the context of the literary debates around the time that he was emerging as a writer and studying as a graduate student and so on. So And, of course, he has it's not quite an Oedipal problem, but a sibling problem with a famous older brother who, and then he studied with John Barth, who was a colleague of his brother's and part of, this famous circle of postmodernist writers. And then, of course, he came of age in the emergence of people like Raymond Carver, who I believe he also studied with, who were, of course, reacting to the excessiveness of the postmodernists with this totally stripped-down minimalist style. And he talks about how he triangulates between, and it's precisely this question, he says, well, look, realism is as much bound up with questions of representation because you're translating the reality into language on the page. It's not reality that gets down on the page. It's words, right? It's the same problem we have, right? Thesis isn't. There's a very famous exchange apparently between Mallarmé and Degas, where Degas, the painter, has been experimenting with writing poems, and he says to his friend Mallarmé, the poet, that he has some ideas for poems, but they just aren't coming together. And Mallarmé says, poems are not made out of ideas, they're made out of words. So I may have gotten that wrong, but that's essentially the translation there. So anyways, great essay. Everyone should read this essay. The subtitle of which is "Convicted Minimalist Spills the Beans" or something like that. It's also funny, I mean, that's the other thing, is Fred Bartlemay is a very, funny, interesting
I
writer.
think I mean, finding those essays written by people who are at a kind of juncture, both within their field and also within their own careers. I mean, the one that comes to mind for me is David Foster Wallace, right? Early, it's something fiction and the conspicuously young. Yeah. And Wallace gives a kind of indictment of the contemporary scene, and he kind of goes after some of his contemporaries and backs up some of the others. But basically, he was in that essay setting up what he eventually put down in Infinite Jest.
Exactly.
Which was postmodern fiction is too kind of weird and pinchiny, and irony has run its course. Right. And can we figure out how to redeploy the techniques of irony to produce a new kind of earnestness? Right. And which is what he did, and it killed him. Yeah. But to find and I think that they exist all over the place. So, you find the one that kind of tastes good.
Exactly. Yeah.
But the other thing about Wallace is also very funny.
Exactly. Yeah.
But all of those things that what these essays are not are recipes.
Exactly.
They're analogies or metaphors in a way. They're like they're kind of models for how to approach the problem, as opposed to recipes for conducting the research. And so, like, these are the kind of things you want to get at early. Right. But we're still early in the process, right? I mean, so you've got the whole summer to kind of make a thing, and to keep reminding yourself through essays like this what making that thing involves. And making that thing doesn't involve writing the history of that thing or writing the theory of that thing. That's somebody else's job.
Exactly, and it's, I mean, these are not things that you have, again, you have to read and put into your thesis statement with a footnote. They're things that really should just inform your way of working. So we keep touching on James's work, and I did want to, because I know we're at some point we need to kind of wrap up a little bit, but I just it's great stuff. I mean, so what do you do with this? I guess I'd just love to hear, again, a little bit. I'd like to hear a little more shop talk from you, actually, because I'd like to know a little bit more about, because you're going from the two-dimensional condition of the pixel, which is about the reduction of information. Right. You're sort of vectorizing that, but you're keeping it within, not in a two-dimensional realm, but in a kind of thickened surface, right? And then, of course, you're also working between figure and field, obviously, and the zoom in is part of that. I don't know if the pointillist references are the most important ones. I mean, I think, you know, late 20th century, like even, you know, pop art painting, I mean, the opticality of...
But I wonder, even...
Antonioni and blow up.
Well, yeah,
The idea
yeah,
that
that's true.
the more you see,
That's really
the more-
nice.
the less
You know that reference?
What is that?
Antonioni, blow up.
Wonderful film.
Michelangelo Antonioni.
Who was trained as an architect, by the way. And it's just a great film to
Yeah.
watch. I mean, you know, it's London in
Starts and
1968.
finishes with AA students.
It does, actually. It's true.
But, and you should all wear that uniform. But another thing that this, I now realize that a debate that this seems to echo, which is a little closer to home, is that between Peter Eisenman and Bob Somel in the late 90s, early 2000s, where what you've done, James, I now realize, is kind of collapsed the difficult, easy distinction into itself. You know, that you're doing easy forms with the most difficult techniques possible.
That's really interesting.
And so again, I mean, that's a good hook for somebody writing the review of your thesis after it's over. But I think what that allows you to do is look at where that debate kind of came to a stalemate, which I think it did. I mean, you know, like nobody won.
Right.
And in a way, you see that you could use that not as a problem to finally solve, but as a kind of set of raw material, like a problem that has dissolved, and a set of raw materials that could be reanimated to produce some kind of zombie version of the cartoon.
Yeah, and then there was an exhibition right around that same time that Greg Lynn did at the ICA Philadelphia called Intricacy. There's a good catalog. Were you in that show? No. Which you know, put together architects and artists, right? So somebody like Tom Friedman, you know his work, artists. You should definitely look at his work. And yeah, I mean, again, I mean, you've got Bob Somel shape questions together with Greg Lynn intricacy. That's you know, I mean, again, you could almost say the mark of a successful thesis is to take things that we thought were incompatible and put them together in an unexpected way.
That becomes the challenge, right? I mean, what you now see, you have the recipe for that kind of theoretical ambiguity that I described, where you know, this is as comfortable in the world of Bob's easy shapes as it is in the world of Greg's difficult form.
Yeah, exactly.
And because because it acts as a kind of double agent between you know, seemingly incompatible warring factions, it opens up new ways to see both of those factions, but also makes a space that debate didn't notice.
Right. But yeah, I mean, again, I think you're. I mean, have you thought about the next step here? I mean,
I've thought about many different ways that I don't want to take it.
Yeah.
So I don't want to just extrude these things. I don't want to just try to make a three-dimensional space, which friends keep saying, how can you make this into 3D? And I don't think that should be the first thing that comes to mind. And then thinking about it architecturally, okay, it could be a facade system, or it could be like layering facades, or it could be some sort of scab to existing architecture. Like, how can this be used in the world? How can we use this after school? Or is it purely just an idea that that I can extrapolate? Okay, these are two things in context that it's the reversal of an abstraction. It's adding all of this complexity. Can I take that and then take that into an architectural project?
Yeah.
And these guys, these little characters on the side, and they don't actually matter, but it's about the process.
Yeah, I think that's correct. I mean, I think that you. I mean, first of all, I mean, this would seem in some ways to be, you know, the least worldly of the projects we looked at. But I think I mean, to me, it's very deeply embedded in, you know, the problematics of, you know, what it means to look at the world today, right? That we look at the world today, you know, through all these filters of media and I mean, I don't know, do cartoons belong to the world or do they belong to the discipline? I think they belong to the world, so I don't have that problem. I think it just, there's something about these constructions that you've made as a way of seeing the world and sort of constructing our subjectivity under the conditions of mediated reception today that kind of ring true, that if you were to take some of the techniques and, I don't know, almost like plug, I mean, what if the source material instead of a cartoon were, I don't know, were certain, were buildings or plans or fragments of cities. I don't know. I think it could yield something really interesting.
Or this could even become the plan for a building. Like, this is the aerial view of a new campus.
Definitely.
Yeah, and again, I think, exactly. I think these things, it can become very formulaic if you say simply turn that into a building. But I think here's where the city comes to your rescue, right? That the city has a degree of embedded complexity that means that the translations will never be as immediate and direct. So
the other thing I find this, originally I was thinking that this is in an interesting contrast with Connor's project, that Connor, you've got a world of forms, and the kind of surface language is suppressed in order to make and James has no forms but has a kind of surface logic. But the more I look at it, the more I think you're actually more in a conversation with Sasha, in that both projects seem to be highly concerned with the status of boundary, right? So you're taking these very simply bounded images and messing up their edges, right? But you don't really have a theory for doing that. You're just doing that, which is, I think, a great way to work. And Sasha, you're really interested in the theoretical implications of doing that. Like, what does it mean to make a border? What do you have to leave out in order to make that border legible, et cetera, et cetera? And so there is a kind of very interesting resonance between the body of scholarship that you've been digging into and just the kind of studio experiments that you've been doing. And I mean, this is not to say they join forces and do it, but I think the two of you could learn a lot from speaking to each other about how you strangely backed into a similar problem.
So I think that we can do a closing comment, or we can, your lecture will probably be the next step for closing comment.
Yeah, whatever. I would just, reiterate and look, the fact that these projects have triggered a series of interesting discussions is a good measure of the sophistication and interest of the thinking that's put out there. So it all looks very promising.
So we have 3 more weeks or less to prove where is it going. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you,